I told my ex that I didn't want to get back together but that he still had to support me financially, and he said it wasn't his problem. Main story. I have always believed that being a mother is the highest form of martyrdom a woman can achieve, a sacred duty that places us on a different moral plane than men. When I was with Julian, the father of my children, I made sure our home was a sanctuary of my values, even if he didn't always appreciate the spiritual weight I carried. For years, I allowed him to be the provider because that was his natural lower function in our family unit, while I handled the heavy lifting of emotional and moral guidance. It was a balance that worked because it dictated the terms of our sanctity, ensuring our children were raised with the best of everything. However, as I grew more in tune with my own needs, I realized Julian was no longer capable of meeting the standards of the woman I had become. The breakup was a necessary sacrifice for my own peace of mind, a cleansing of my personal space that I handled with more grace than he deserved. I expected him to understand that even though our romantic contract had ended, his role as the financial engine of my household was a lifetime appointment ordained by the very fact that I birthed his children. Lately, however, the bank account has been looking disturbingly empty, a reality that feels like a personal insult to the work I do every day. I found myself looking at my two beautiful children and feeling a deep sense of indignation that they might have to settle for anything less than the lifestyle I've cultivated. It's not about greed. It's about the justice of maintaining the environment a mother of my caliber provides. I decided the only way to resolve this was to have a mature, guided conversation with Julian. So I invited him to a very upscale café in the city center. I arrived early, ordering a premium organic latte that cost more than most people spend on lunch, but I needed the right energy to face him. As I sat there checking my balance on my phone, I felt a wave of righteous anger that I even had to ask for what is rightfully mine. Julian has always been a bit materialistic, so I knew I had to be very clear about where we stood so he wouldn't get any ideas about a reconciliation. My time and my affection are rewards for those who truly align with my spirit, and Julian had lost that privilege long ago. When he finally walked in, he looked tired and remarkably ordinary, which only confirmed that I had made the right choice in leaving him. He sat down and tried to make small talk about the kids' school projects, but I cut him off because I didn't want him to think he could bypass the real issue with pleasantries. I told him quite clearly that I had reached a higher state of clarity and that there was absolutely no chance of us ever getting back together. I watched his face for a reaction, expecting him to be devastated by the finality of my words, but he just nodded slowly as if he were checking a box. It was a bit rude, honestly, considering the emotional weight of what I was sharing, but I moved on to the more important matter. I explained to him that while our personal bond was severed, his financial obligation to me was a moral debt that didn't just vanish because we weren't sleeping in the same bed. I told him that I needed an extra $2,000 a month on top of the basic child support because the kids are used to a certain level of excellence that only I can provide. I framed it as an opportunity for him to show he still respected the institution of motherhood that I represent. I even told him that it was his duty to ensure I didn't have to stress about bills, as my stress directly affects the vibrational quality of our children's home. I was being incredibly reasonable, offering him a way to stay connected to my greatness through his wallet. Julian didn't say anything for a long minute, just staring at his coffee while I waited for him to thank me for being so transparent. Then he looked up with a coldness I had never seen before, a lack of empathy that honestly frightened me for a second. He told me that if I didn't want to be his partner, then I didn't get to enjoy the perks of his partnership anymore. He said he would pay what the law required for the children and not a single penny more to fund my spiritual lifestyle or my expensive lattes. I was stunned by his selfishness, especially when I reminded him that I am the mother of his children and my comfort is their comfort. The conversation took a sharp turn when he leaned in and told me that his obligation ended where my entitlement began. I tried to explain that as a mother, I am the moral center of this family and he's just the peripheral support, but he wouldn't even let me finish. He actually laughed, a dry, mocking sound that felt like a slap in the face to everything I've sacrificed for this family. He told me that since I wanted to be independent and at peace, I could find a way to pay for that peace myself. I felt the tears welling up, not of sadness but of pure, unadulterated shock at how a man could be so heartless toward the woman who gave him a family. Before I could even gather my things to make a dignified exit, he stood up and threw a few bills on the table to cover his drink and mine. He looked at me and said, "From now on, if it's not about the kids' medical bills or school tuition, don't call me, it's not my problem anymore." He walked out of that cafe without even looking back, leaving me sitting there in front of half a latte and a pile of bills that suddenly felt like a mountain. I was left trembling, wondering how the world could be so cruel to someone who only wants the best for her children. It's clear that he's trying to punish me for my boundaries, using money as a weapon to destroy the sanctity I've worked so hard to build. I sat there for another 20 minutes, feeling the judgmental eyes of the other patrons, though I'm sure they were just admiring my poise in the face of such blatant disrespect. It's terrifying to realize that the man I trusted for so long has no sense of the divine debt he owes to the mother of his children. He thinks he can just walk away from his role because I won't give him my body or my heart anymore. But a role isn't a choice, it's a responsibility, and Julian is failing the most important test of his life. I'll have to find another way to maintain our standards, but I will never forget the day he chose his bank account over his family's moral foundation. Main story comments. Anonymous user 1 says you literally told him he's just a ATM and then got mad when the ATM stopped giving out free cash. That's not martyrdom, that's just a bad business plan. Ops reply, it's tragic that you see the sacred support of a mother as a business plan. But I suppose some people just lack the spiritual depth to understand the weight of my sacrifice. Anonymous user 2 says, I want the money but not the man, is a bold strategy when you're already broken up. He's right, your lifestyle isn't his problem anymore. Ops reply, my lifestyle is the environment my children live in, so yes, it is his problem unless he wants his own flesh and blood to suffer for his pettiness. Update 1. It has been 3 weeks since Julian's disgusting display of financial domestic violence at the cafe, and things have only gone from bad to worse. I realized that since he had clearly lost his mind, I needed to reach out to his mother Evelyn to help her see how her son was failing his moral duties. I've always been the daughter she never had, often spending hours listening to her complaints about her hip or her garden, so I expected her to be my greatest ally. I invited her over for tea, making sure to hide the more expensive candles I'd bought recently so she wouldn't get the wrong idea about my wealth. I explained the situation with a heavy heart, emphasizing how much the children were missing their father's generosity. Evelyn sat there in my living room, nodding as I spoke about the divine burden of motherhood and how Julian was essentially starving our children of their rightful status. I told her that she needed to speak to him, to remind him that a man's worth is measured by how well he serves the mother of his children. I even suggested that maybe she could help bridge the financial gap herself if Julian remained stubborn, as a grandmother's love should know no bounds. I was being so vulnerable, opening my heart to her about the trauma Julian was putting us through. I really thought she would take my side and perhaps even write a check right then and there to settle the immediate bills. Instead, Evelyn looked around my perfectly decorated living room and asked me why I hadn't looked for a job yet if things were so dire. I was floored by the insensitivity of the question, as if my job isn't raising the next generation of her own bloodline with the highest possible values. I explained to her that my presence in the home is vital for the kids' emotional development, and that working would be a betrayal of my maternal calling. She didn't seem to care, and in fact, she had the audacity to tell me that Julian had already spoken to her. Apparently, he told her that I was delusional, and that he was already giving me more than enough for the children's actual needs. The betrayal felt like a cold blade in my back as Evelyn stood up to leave, barely touching her tea. She told me that while she loves the grandchildren, she won't be manipulated into funding a lifestyle that I can no longer afford on my own. She even had the nerve to suggest I move to a smaller apartment, as if I should have to cram my children into some hovel just because Julian is being a miser. I watched her walk to her car, feeling like the entire world was conspiring against the sanctity of my home. It's clear that Julian has poisoned his own mother's mind against me, turning her into another tool for his financial abuse. I spent the rest of the evening in tears, looking at my bills and wondering how people can be so blind to the greater good I represent. I had to cancel the kids' private swimming lessons the next day, which felt like a personal failure, though I know it's entirely Julian's fault. I told the children that their father was going through a difficult time, and that we had to make sacrifices because he was being forgetful of his duties. They looked so confused and sad, and it broke my heart to see them suffer because of their father's ego. I am the only one holding this family together with my prayers and my will, while everyone else just looks at numbers on a screen. Update 1 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, so you tried to shake down your ex-mother-in-law too? You're not a martyr. You're a professional moocher with a spiritual vocabulary. Oops, reply, seeking help from family is not mooching. It's called community support, something you clearly wouldn't understand from your basement. Anonymous user 2 says, financial domestic violence for not getting extra money for organic lattes and swimming lessons. You are genuinely insulting actual victims of abuse. Ops reply, abuse comes in many forms, and withholding resources to control and humble a mother is a very real, very dark form of psychological warfare. Update 2. 1 month has passed since my family turned their backs on me, and I decided that if they wouldn't listen to the voice of morality, they would have to listen to the voice of the law. I hired a lawyer, a very expensive one, because I believe you have to invest in justice, and filled for a formal increase in child support. I was convinced that once a judge saw my sacrifices and the standard of living I provide, they would force Julian to pay even more than I had originally asked for. I spent days preparing my evidence, which included receipts for the kids' high-end organic supplements and their specialized art classes. I felt like a warrior for my children, marching into that courtroom to claim what was rightfully ours. The day of the hearing, I wore my most humble yet elegant outfit, wanting to look like a mother who had been pushed to the brink but maintained her dignity. Julian showed up with a lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. A man who clearly lacked any sense of the divine nature of our dispute. I sat there with my head high, ready to explain to the judge how Julian's not my problem attitude was a direct threat to the moral fabric of society. My lawyer started talking about equitable distribution and the best interests of the children, and I felt so validated in that moment. I thought, finally someone sees the truth. However, the mood shifted dramatically when Julian's lawyer stood up and presented a thick folder of his own. He had documented every single extra penny Julian had given me over the last 2 years, thousands of dollars above the legal requirement that I had used for my spiritual retreats and designer yoga gear. He argued that Julian had been incredibly overgenerous and that I was using the children as a shield for my own vanity. I wanted to scream that my yoga gear is essential for the peace I provide the children, but my lawyer told me to stay quiet. It was infuriating to see my life's work reduced to a series of line items by a man who doesn't even know me. The judge, a woman who I thought would surely understand the plight of a mother, looked through the papers with a very grim expression. She asked me why I hadn't sought employment in the 6 months since the breakup, and I gave her my standard explanation about the sanctity of the home. She didn't seem impressed. In fact, she looked annoyed, which I found deeply unprofessional. She then dropped the bombshell based on Julian's actual income and the state guidelines. He had actually been overpaying me by nearly $800 a month. She said that while she wouldn't make me pay him back, she was setting the new support amount strictly by the law. The new amount is significantly less than what Julian was giving me voluntarily before I decided to take him to court. I sat there in total shock, watching my victory turn into a financial massacre right before my eyes. Julian didn't even look happy. He just looked relieved, which felt like a personal insult to my entire existence. My lawyer, who I still have to pay, whispered that we should have settled out of court, as if this was somehow my fault for seeking justice. I walked out of that building feeling like I had been mugged by the state. Another victim of a system that hates strong, moral women. Update 2 comments. Anonymous user 1 says you literally sued your way into a pay cut. This is the most hilarious self-own I've seen on this sub in a long time. Ops reply, it's not a self-own. It's a systemic failure to recognize that a mother's time is worth more than a bureaucrat's spreadsheet. Anonymous user 2 says so he was being generous and you tried to force him to give more, so now he's giving the bare minimum? You played yourself, Oopsie reply, he wasn't being generous. He was doing his duty and now he's using a legal technicality to neglect his children's well-being. Update 3. 2 months have gone by since the justice system decided to punish me for being a mother, and the reality of my situation has become a daily cross to bear. I've had to sell my SUV, the one with the heated seats that the kids loved, and replace it with a sensible drab sedan that smells like old upholstery. Every time I turn the key, I feel a pang of resentment toward Julian for forcing me into such a common existence. I've started shopping at discount grocery stores, hiding the generic labels in my designer reusable bags so the neighbors don't see how far I've fallen. It's a performance of poverty that I find absolutely degrading to my soul. I reached out to Julian one last time, purely out of mercy, to give him a chance to fix the mess he's made. I told him that the kids were traumatized by the new car and that he should at least pay for a lease on something safer and more appropriate for their status. He didn't even call me back. He just sent a short text saying, "Refer to the court order." The coldness of that message was like a winter wind blowing through my heart, proving that he has truly lost his humanity. He's treating the mother of his children like a legal adversary instead of the sacred partner he once had the honor of knowing. To make ends meet, I had to sell several pieces of jewelry Julian gave me during our happier times, back when he still understood his role. I told myself it was a cleansing of his negative energy, but seeing those beautiful pieces on a pawn shop counter was a spiritual trauma I wouldn't wish on anyone. I received pennies on the dollar for them, another sign that the world doesn't value the treasures of a woman's history. I used the money to pay for the kids' private school tuition for the next semester because I refused to let them descend into the chaos of public education. I am literally selling my memories to keep their heads above water while Julian probably buys himself a new golf club. The kids have started asking why we don't go on spa weekends anymore, and I have to tell them that Daddy chose to keep the money for himself. It's the truth, even if it's uncomfortable for people to hear, because I refuse to lie to them about the nature of their father's character. I see the way they look at me, their tired, holy mother, and I know they see the truth of my martyrdom. I am the only one who truly loves them, while Julian only loves his court order and his ego. I'm living on the edge of a cliff, held up only by my own moral superiority and the hope that one day he will realize what he's destroyed. Update 3 comments. Anonymous user 1 says you're literally poisoning your kids against their father because you can't afford a luxury SUV anymore. You're the one traumatizing them. Ops reply, I am teaching them about accountability and the reality of a father who prioritizes orders over their comfort and happiness. Anonymous user 2 says selling jewelry he gave you to pay for private school isn't martyrdom. It's called having a budget. Welcome to the real world. Ops reply, in the real world, people like you lack the vision to see that my budget is a reflection of my children's worth, which is infinite. Update 4. It has been 6 months since this nightmare began, and I have finally settled into my new role as a humble servant of the household. We moved into a much smaller apartment, a place that lacks the vibrational resonance of our old home, but I have filled it with my own light and a few thrifted crystals. Julian still pays only the court-mandated amount, and he has the audacity to spend his weekends taking the kids to parks and museums instead of paying for the expensive camps they deserve. He thinks he's involved, but I know that without my guidance and my demands for more, he's just providing a hollow, cheap version of fatherhood. I see the kids coming back from his house with smiles that I know are forced, probably because they don't want to hurt his feelings, after he's clearly failed them so deeply. I've had to take a job at a local boutique, a position that is far beneath my intellectual and spiritual capacity, but I do it for the children. I spend my days folding clothes for women who have no idea what it means to truly sacrifice, watching them spend money I used to have as if it's nothing. I treat every customer with a saintly patience, knowing that I am morally superior to every one of them because I am doing what I must while they just exist. Sometimes, I catch my reflection in the boutique's mirrors and see a woman who has been purified by her suffering, a modern-day saint in a world of misers and bureaucrats. I know that one day, Julian will look back on his life and realize that he traded a queen for a few extra dollars in his savings account. My children will eventually grow up and realize that their mother was the only one who fought for the excellence they were born for. They will see that their father was content with the bare minimum, while I was willing to sue, to sell my jewels, and to work just to keep their spirits high. I haven't spoken to Julian in months except through a co-parenting app, and even then, I make sure my tone is one of distant, holy disappointment. He may have won in the eyes of a cold secular court, but in the eyes of the divine, he is a man who defaulted on his most sacred debt. I am at peace with my struggle because a martyr's crown is never light, and I wear mine with the pride of a woman who knows she is right.